We as a First Nation, we always knew that it is Mother Nature who is the driving force of our livelihood. It is Mother Nature that controls our livelihood. We need to work with Mother Nature.
Our country, we're a global treasure. We have a quarter of the world's fresh water. We have the largest coastline in the world. We have some of the largest populations of iconic species. It stands to reason that there's a global interest in protecting the Canadian North because our country, our land and water is a national treasure. It's also a global treasure.
One of the roles that we are as Indigenous people, we are the stewards of the land. So I think that that can be done at the same time as being able to sign off agreements and making sure that these companies are doing their due diligence.
It's not an exaggeration to say that millions of people are worried about the future of the planet. People are scared. They're scared that burning fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, is making the climate worse. And our country, Canada, is accused of being one of the worst offenders.
Canada's climate performance is the worst in the entire Western world.
This massive energy project is causing a lot of concern in environmental circles. One organisation has even labelled it the most destructive project on Earth.
Canada's tar sands will mean game over for the climate.
There's a movement now, a global movement, to go off fossil fuels, and even the oil industry is on board.
The framework announced today will allow the ongoing innovation, technology, investment, and growth in the oil and gas industry at the same time we are looking to reduce our overall carbon emissions. In this way, we will do our part to address climate change while protecting jobs and industry competitiveness in Alberta.
But not in the United States.
The U.S. is producing more oil than ever. Most of that extra production comes from the Permian Basin in West Texas, making the state America's top oil producer. More and more of that oil is making its way through the port of Corpus Christi and around the world.
We expect our exports to double. It is amazing, to double between now and 2020.
We're actually pushing the oil industry to take advantage of the opportunities that they've already got.
Tremendous to think that we've gone from potentially being a big natural gas importer and even more of an oil importer to being the world's largest producer of petroleum and natural gas for 5 years running.
Here in Canada, we can't build pipelines. We can't even build a natural gas pipeline to help China get off coal.
It's becoming a common occurrence in our city. A protest was organized in opposition to all pipeline production in the region, not just Enbridge.
No! Tar sands! No! Tar sands!
I hear the voice of my great-granddaughter say, keep it in the ground.
Woo! Without pipelines, Canada can only sell oil and natural gas to the United States. So the US has a monopoly on Canada and no incentive to pay world prices. Last fall, it got so bad that Canadian oil producers were losing $50 on every barrel of oil.
The price of a barrel of oil from Alberta's oil sands has fallen to a record low.
The problem is the widening gap between Canadian and US produced oil. Take West Texas Intermediate, an industry benchmark, and it closed today around $56 a barrel. But Alberta's Western Canadian Select was selling around $13 a barrel.
Our energy sector in Canada is distressed, and at the same time, the U.S. energy sector is booming. And some of our homegrown leading businesses, such as Encana, TransCanada, Enbridge, are shifting their focus to the United States. Investment capital is exiting. And I have direct knowledge that some of our best equipment and some of our most talented workers are exiting.
So if we're going to produce oil, we might as well get world prices for it. Not subsidize the price of gas in the United States to the tune of tens of billions of dollars. Building pipelines is about breaking the American monopoly that has Canada over a barrel. We never used to talk about pipelines. They were out of sight, out of mind, rarely in the news. But they are now.
When I say no, you say pipeline. No! Pipeline! No! Pipeline!
The reason for that is a campaign. It's called the Tar Sands Campaign, and I stumbled across it 9 years ago in 2010, June of 2010, during the course of some other work that I was doing on the funding of another controversy, the fish farm fuss.
Costco, farm salmon has to go.
I've worked in charity most of my life, 10 years in Guatemala and Indonesia. And when I came back to Canada, I got into salmon farming. The chiefs that I talked to believed in it, and I figured if it was good enough for them in their traditional territories, it's good enough for me.
It's been tremendous. We have First Nations people from our reserve working on these boats, plus many of them working at the plant, and some of them on the campsites tendering. It's absolutely great for our people.
A few years later, I was a volunteer director on a board of a Canadian charity called the Adoptive Families Association. And I was looking for funding for that charity when, quite unexpectedly, I stumbled across something called an anti-farming campaign. That was a grant for about $560,000 for the coordination of the campaign against salmon farming. The thing that struck me about this anti-farming campaign is that it was to involve science messages. I couldn't help but wonder what they were. And I thought back to a letter that I had received years earlier from the David Suzuki Foundation. At the time, I was a supporter of the foundation, so I got its fundraising letters in the mail. And in this one particular letter, personally signed by David Suzuki, he wrote to thank his supporters for helping us to, as he put it, uncover the fact that BC farmed salmon is heavily contaminated with PCBs and other toxins. Well, I worked in the salmon farming industry at the time, and I was not aware of any studies that even remotely suggested that farmed salmon was heavily contaminated. So I dug up the original scientific paper that David Suzuki was referring to. And what I found is that the mercury levels were actually higher in the wild salmon than in the farmed, and the whole study only had 8 fish. So obviously, David Suzuki had not uncovered the fact that he said he did, and I wondered why. Why would David Suzuki say something that was so obviously untrue?
We're here today in the heart of the tar sands, the new frontier of climate destruction, to shut down this large oil sands mining project, to say no to the tar sands, because real climate leaders don't buy tar sands.
I've had the same concern about what activist groups are saying about the greenhouse gases associated with producing oil from the oil sands.
The Canadian oil sands are the largest industrial project on Earth.
Oil sands production emits 3 to 4 times more greenhouse gases than producing conventional crude oil. This makes it one of the world's dirtiest forms of fuel.
There is a grain of truth to that. Producing oil from the oil sands is associated with slightly higher greenhouse gas emissions, but 10 to 20% higher, not 300 to 400% higher, which is what environmental groups have been saying.
No pipeline on our territories.
My journey into politics started in 2003. I was elected onto the band council after serving in my community in various activities like basketball coaching and volunteering for certain events. And so when I joined the council in 2003, I thought that I could access some of council's resources and divert it to my basketball teams. And I found out that my council, not only was my council broke, they were in such a bad deficit that Canada was threatening to come in and take over and shut us down. And that opened my world to the Indian Act, treaty, Aboriginal rights and title, government structures, anything I could get my hands on to read. And I took it from there. I couldn't stand to see my people living with 60 to 80% unemployment. Unless you face this issue head on, then you can't really resolve it. And I tried to look at programming through the government dollars, didn't work. I tried to look at programming through treaty, that didn't work. I tried everything I could to try to get our people on a better path, and it all failed. And that's when I realized I got to give economic development a shot. I got to look into LNG, I got to look into forestry, I got to look into mining. I got to give these people a purpose in life.
The scenes are dramatic, headlined by a clash between police and protesters.
We don't need protesters protesting on our behalf.
As soon as a project is stopped, stalled, or just no more, they leave that community. They don't come back and help plant trees. They don't come back and help the community members get jobs. They just leave them with nothing.
We are reclaiming ourselves, and we are reclaiming everything that makes.
It was encouraging me to phone up Vivian Krause and meet her, and I Googled some of her stuff, and then I phoned her up, and I just told her, I said, you know, you sound pretty loony. You sound like you're a tinfoil wearing hat type person, but we got to meet. You got to show me your facts. So we met, and she pulled out her research, and I was fairly shocked, and she did so much meticulous research, and that's when I read what she had, and I was shocked that this was going on for 10 years, and nobody had been really paying attention to her.
We're here today because Canada's Environment Minister Peter Kent has arrived in Durban, and he's made it very clear that he's here to push tar sands oil on the rest of the world. So we thought we'd hold a little welcoming party for him and help him push the dirtiest oil on the planet, tar sands oil.
While I was still trying to figure out the funding of the campaign against salmon farming, I stumbled across these three little words: tar sands campaign. That was back in June of 2010. One of the things that got my attention is that the tar sands campaign was funded by the Rockefellers via one of their charities, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. We know this for sure because it says so in their tax returns.
No, I go back to the funders, and it's so hypocritical that the funders from the United States, who made their fortune in oil and gas, now send money into Canada to shut down Canadian oil and gas.
And in 2008, they helped launch the Tar Sands campaign. Another billion-dollar foundation, California's Hewlett Foundation, also helps fund the pipeline fight. Based on some of the tax records we've obtained, the American money adds up to millions of dollars, much of it funneled to Canadian environmental groups, often through another like-minded U.S. charity called the Tides Foundation.
Back in 2010, when I first stumbled across this campaign, there was virtually no publicly available online information about it. You could Google tar sands campaign and you got nothing. So it wasn't entirely clear what this campaign was about. But now it is, because Corporate Ethics posted a description of the tar sands campaign at its website. It said that from the very beginning, the campaign strategy was to landlock what they call the tar sands so that the crude could not reach the international market where it could get a higher price per barrel.
Then there's the American charity Corporate Ethics, also enlisted in the fight. Its website reveals what all those U.S. dollars actually accomplished. The campaign successfully landlocked the Canadian tar sands industry by blocking the approval of all major proposed pipelines in Canada and the U.S. The controversy from this campaign contributed to political victories at the provincial and national levels in Canada in 2015 that led to bold climate commitments by Canadian leaders.
Back in January of 2019, CBC reported on the tar sands campaign, and within days, Corporate Ethics rewrote the entire description of the tar sands campaign. In 2006, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund paid $200,000 to a pair of Canadian charities, the Pembina Foundation, which funds the Pembina Institute, and West Coast Environmental Law. The thing that caught my attention is that those payments to prevent the development of a pipeline and tanker port specified that the reason for doing so was to protect the Great Bear Rainforest.
Long before I got into council, we had an initiative to save the Kitlope, and environmentalists had become a part of that campaign. I was running a charter boat at the time, and I was running people in and out of there with my brothers. I was listening to the rhetoric, and I was listening to what was being said at public meetings and everything. I was drinking the Kool-Aid back then. I really thought, oh great, we're going to save the world, we save Kitlope, and what really cemented me the idea of protecting this rainforest was because my community had no part in the economy up to then. But these environmentalists on the fringes said that if we protect the rainforest and protect it from logging, then we could create an economy for tourism and everybody could get jobs. Well, they protected the rainforest in an order in council through BC, and not one job materialized except for a few key people that were inside the circle of the actual protest itself. And nothing changed for my community.
The great bear, also called the great spirit bear, is actually black bear. It's a phase or a variety of the black bear that's blonde. Beautiful bear. And there's about 100 of them in a relatively small area of the north coast of BC. The Rockefellers know very well where the bear lives because in the 1990s they funded the original study of the area. And if they had stuck to protecting that, that would be great. But that's not what they're doing. So now environmental groups and even the government of British Columbia would have us believe that the Great Bear Rainforest extends all the way from the north end of Vancouver Island to the south of Alaska, and then this ecosystem just comes to a screeching halt.
A groundbreaking deal that will protect much of BC's Great Bear Rainforest. The agreement covers 6.4 million hectares of land near Bella Coola. Under terms of an agreement between the province, First Nations, forest companies, and environmentalists, 85% of the old-growth forest will be permanently protected. Logging will still be allowed in the other 15% under strict conditions.
The Great Bear Rainforest is there's no question, it's a jewel in the crown of magnificent landscape in British Columbia. And it's a jewel for all Canadians.
You know, we had the Jerry Buttses and that whole group, that group of people that created the title Great Bear Rainforest. Our own people fed into that. They all came together and they won the battle. They won the battle of that day in terms of putting together a well-developed plan of propaganda.
As far back as 2012, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund funded the New Venture Fund, specifically to get a limit or a cap put on production of oil out of Alberta. And of course, when the former Premier of Alberta, Rachel Notley, brought in her climate plan in 2015, that's exactly what she did.
Friends, the government of Alberta is going to stop being the problem, and we are going to start being the solution.
With us are people and organizations who have long called for action on climate change. Steve Williams of Suncor, Brian Ferguson of Cenovus, Lorraine Mitchell-Moore of Shell.
The emissions limit legislation, the idea, the genesis for it, Madam Speaker, came to us through collaborative conversations between the oil sands industry, between First Nations, municipalities, and from environmental groups, Madam Speaker.
Alberta also increased its carbon tax and created the world's largest boreal forest preserve. It's huge, twice the size of Vancouver Island.
Until recently, Canada's best prospects for meeting other markets was through the proposed Keystone XL pipeline.
It's 2019 now, and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund is still funding activism against the Keystone pipeline. The most recent payment was in May of 2019, $50,000 to a group in Nebraska.
When you consider that Canada's population is less than the state of California, they need resources. We are right here. We are the world's longest unarmed border. We're easy picking. And so right now, the picking is economically.
Make no mistake, the industries are not saints. They are not saints at all. But they sure are a night and day difference from what they were doing 30 years ago.
Whether it was the Rockefellers' intention or not, what is being protected is the American monopoly that has Canada over a barrel and is subsidizing the price of gas in the United States to the tune of tens of billions of dollars. Now, under Justin Trudeau, the federal government has banned oil tanker traffic on the north coast of BC with Bill C-48. They call it a tanker ban, but actually it's an export ban because it doesn't stop any of the oil tankers from Alaska or anywhere else from importing oil into the lower 48.
The Great Bear Rainforest is no place for a pipeline.
Offensive, strangling,
devastating. Those were just some of the words used to describe Bill C-48 today. That bill would essentially ban all oil tanker traffic off the coast of British Columbia.
So when we started talking about coastal protection, hooray, we got no. C-48 went through, it won by 3 votes. We're not going to have tankers on the North Coast. Everybody celebrates. Not a time to celebrate because 8.6 billion gallons of crude went by Haida Gwaii from Valdez alone to the lower 48 last year. And 278 ships are going by Haida Gwaii every year. Without question, this is going on. So we don't have protection.
We are price takers, we are not price getters, and that needs to change. When I see, if one of my neighbors was doing that to me, I'd get bloody angry about it.
The organizations that have led the charge to create the Great Bear Rainforest are Tides Canada and Coastal First Nations.
We heard it far too many times at our table, Tides Canada. And we heard some people were too happy to tell us that, well, we know where they're getting their money from. They're getting it from Tides Canada. And you know what? They're getting millions.
Back in 2004, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund paid $1 million for the capital to create Coastal First Nations and another $100,000 for startup. And then on Christmas Eve, 2004, a non-profit called the Coast Economic Development Society was incorporated. But as far as I can tell, it was financially inactive for the next 3 years until it got funding from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, the same foundation that funds the campaign against salmon farming and has since poured at least $270 million into activism in Canada. Coastal First Nations, $30 million, Tides Canada, at least $85 million, one grant alone in 2015 for $10 million.
Well, we knew there was some pretty heavy-duty money coming in from somewhere because the aggression was too strong and it was too directed. And it was directed to any group that dare spoke about anything oil and gas. And not once did they ever attempt to ask us what our place was within that industry.
This issue is as black and white as a killer whale. Saying no to the Enbridge pipeline is as black and white as the killer whales that are threatened by that pipeline.
The crowd was led to dance like Canadian animals such as the orca.
I mean, we're underdogs, sure. But some movements have spent billions of dollars going nowhere. I know I've spent some of it. As a digital guy, I spent my career for a lot of clients building fake grassroots campaigns that tried to surround a target and make it seem like there was a social movement happening and scare them into making a decision.
Don't spend your time on environmental protection and getting First Nation youth who are unemployed and angry. Don't get them to protest against projects. It's the same teenagers who commit suicide day in and day out within our communities. It is so unfair and cruel. It's a human crisis that these environmentalists don't care about.
I'd never wanted my kids to go through what I went through, going from job to unemployment insurance, to welfare. I mean, I grew up through the 80s and 90s as a young man, struggling to find a job. I got into drugs when I was 14 years old, and it just seemed natural. Nobody thought it was a bad thing. I mean, just a couple weeks ago, me and my wife were talking about it, and I was trying to put into context for people what it really meant at the ground level for people like us. And just off the top of our heads, we recounted 14 people who committed suicide that I had to go to funerals for in my lifetime.
Those agendas, they're basically taking advantage of the situation that we're in, and that's poverty. And I think that when they come in with their own agendas and write checks, and it's self-serving, and they're basically just using us, and these environments come in and pay us, and then they're gone, and the agendas, they got what they accomplished, and we're still sitting here in poverty.
If I'm gonna say no to something, I better find another way to put a meal on the man's table or his family's. Just don't say no and walk away, because that's irresponsible and that's almost genocidal.
No! No!
They came in and they propped up the minority and they turned it into a big fight where Haislas were fighting against Haislas. We ended up in court, tore our community apart, tore our family apart. And then when all the dust settled and we realized, actually, all that wasn't true. It was all built on a lie.
Most of the funding from the Moore Foundation, well over $100 million, has gone towards what they call marine planning, especially for the north coast of British Columbia. That money went to First Nations, environmental groups, and even the BC government for the development of 4 marine plans for the coast of British Columbia. None of them would allow for any tankers or ports or pipelines or other infrastructure that is necessary for the overseas exports of Canadian oil and natural gas.
Just this past year, the people that actually organized the Great Bear Rainforest are now proposing to set up right beside it the Great Bear Sea. Now, is it just coincidence that the Great Bear Sea includes a shipping lane that LNG tankers will travel to get LNG from Kitimat over to Asia? I don't think it's coincidence. I think it's another tactic. Let's sterilize land, let's sterilize waterways, and in that way, indirectly, we can shut down industry.
No doubt about it, the coast of British Columbia is spectacularly beautiful. Alaska's pretty special too. The Oregon coast, California, it's beautiful. But the only place where there's a decade-long, multi-million-dollar Rockefeller-funded campaign to stop oil tanker traffic is in British Columbia. In California, you've got oil rigs right on the beach. One of the key organizations in the marine planning process funded by the Moore Foundation is the World Wildlife Fund Canada, which is funded specifically for facilitating federal government commitment. During the early years, the president of the World Wildlife Fund Canada was Gerald Butts, until he resigned to run the leadership and then the election campaigns for Justin Trudeau. One of the last grants that World Wildlife Fund received while Gerald Butts was still president was $2 million specifically for achieving the conditions and relationships conducive to marine planning. After he resigned, World Wildlife Fund paid Gerald Butts roughly $400,000 as severance. We know it was severance because Mr. Butts has said so on Twitter. Under Justin Trudeau, one of the first things that the federal government did in 2015 was to approve the type of marine plans that had been funded by the Moore Foundation, setting aside a huge area of coastal Canada, roughly the size of Saskatchewan.
You say tankers, no! Tankers! No! Tankers! When I say stand with, you say Tiny House Warriors, stand with!
Another organization funded by the Rockefeller Brothers Fund is OPEN, the Online Progressive Engagement Network. 2015 annual report, OPEN reports that it ran a Canadian campaign that, quote, moved the needle during the 2015 federal election, contributing greatly to the ousting of the Conservative Harper government. How did it do that? Well, OPEN is the parent organization of a Canadian nonprofit called Lead Now. Lead Now portrays itself as a youth movement, the brainchild of 2 university students. But there's more to it than that. Lead Now says that it is supported by more than 2,000 Canadians, and no doubt it is. But where did Lead Now get its original donor base? According to Stratcom, a company created with capital from the Tides Foundation, Stratcom put together Lead Now's database of 1,800 donors. As I was watching the 2015 federal election, I noticed Lead Now, and they were so slick. I thought, who is this organization?
All right, what's this all about? What do you hope to accomplish?
Well, our goal is to create a new way for Canadians to come together online, to talk about their hopes, their shared hopes and priorities for the country, and to create a really strong voice that's going to be heard in Ottawa.
One of the things I found is their original business plan, which called for $16 million over 10 years. I also found photographs of Lead Now attending a meeting with the Rockefeller Brothers Fund in 2012 and other meetings with OPEN in England and in Australia. Lead Now claims credit for having defeated at least 25 Conservative incumbents in the 2015 federal election. That's a bit of a stretch, but in a few ridings where Lead Now had staff, they may have made a difference. In Winnipeg, for example, the Conservative incumbent lost by only 61 votes. And And this fall, they're at it again. LEAD now says it has 800 volunteers working in 149 ridings. So what's wrong with an organization like LEAD Now trying to influence Canada's elections? Well, if LEAD Now is just a youth movement, that's fine. But the truth is that LEAD Now is part of a Rockefeller-funded network of organizations that aims to swing elections in foreign countries. And that, no pun intended, needs to be out in the open.
When you look at charitable organizations that have ulterior motives that damage Canada, that charitable standing needs to be pulled. They need to be banned from working in Canada. Our national government needs to audit. They need to look deep into where the money is coming from, where it's going to.
What they've done to us is actually brilliant. It's pure brilliance. Because they're not doing it themselves. They're getting Canadians to do it to ourselves. And I don't think Canadians understand that this is what's happening to them. It's in a larger scale, they're doing to Canada what they did to my community. So I don't think Canada really understands that the real war here is an outside force pitting Canadians against Canadians.